Hi there, I'm Gina Barrett from Gina-B Silkworks, and in this video I'm going to show you how I've made this tree stump covered in ivy button. So let's get started. Okay, so I've started out using some cotton string. This is an idea that is I had the idea and I thought I'll just film as I go. So I wasn't sure if any of this was going to work. I've decided to twist up the cotton string, and I'm going to then stiffen it using thin layers of toilet tissue, or you could use any type of tissue really, or paper towels. And I'm going to use a matte medium mixed with a little bit of water. I'm actually using Indigo Blue's Slap It On matte because I really like it. And I'm saturating the cotton string. My thinking here is that I want to use the string so that I get a sort of twisted wood gnarly effect. So that's why I've started out this way. I also want it to be a textile based button, so as opposed to just using a piece of wood. So I've split the toilet tissue into the two halves, and then I'm just going to randomly tear it, and I'm going to add it onto the piece and build up the layers, so a little bit like paper mache. I did take quite a long time doing this, going back and forth and adding a bit more of the matte medium. You could use a PVA and water mixture, I'm sure. You might get a little bit of a shiny with a PVA or a tacky glue. As I say, I just know that I like this particular medium. You could use a gel medium too, as I know that it's quite strong and will dry quite matte, which is the effect that I want. I'm wrapping some of the tissue all of the way around, but I am working on a non-stick mat, and that's so that I can flatten out and ensure that the back of the button is flat, because I'm not making a toggle. So here I am adding a bit more, building it up a little bit more. Now I'm just going to snip where I've doubled back on the threads so that I can push apart the string and actually start to create a fork. So I'm adding again more matte medium, more bits of tissue to build up this fork. I've also started adding string on top of the paper, again to give a bit more texture, and I've unraveled some of it so that this carries on the whole sort of gnarly theme. Now I'm going to color. It's still wet, and I'm using something called wood crystals from Stamps Away. I've never used this before, and I end up using two colors because the first color that I put down I felt was a little too red. So I then went on to the second color, which was an oak, and built that up. When I'm happy with the colors that I've added, I also added some dark Inktense, shaved up Inktense pencil to make it even darker. I'm now covering it with more of that matte medium. My thinking is that this will help to seal in. I don't know how the wood crystals will react long term, so I thought I'll just seal them in. And of course, this is going to take a while to dry completely. I'm just making sure all of the ends, everything has got that medium on it so that it can dry and be sealed and protected. Now I'm going to start on the leaves, and I'm using a piece of cotton fabric. This is an offcut from when we create our button journals, and I'm using Inktense pencils. And the first thing that I'm going to do is I'm using a very dark browny green, and I'm doing little sort of curved T shapes and some Y shapes. And this is for the center of the ivy leaves. And of course, you could make any other types of leaves using the method that I'm sort of going to show on this. Again, I wanted the textile, so that's why I'm using the cotton cloth. It's a very, very tight weave cotton, which I find very good for small work when it's been sealed. And I'm just adding them randomly around the fabric. Next, I'm going to take a more traditional green color, and I'm just adding the green just a little bit below and in some cases on top of the previous color. I'm not, there's no special skills here. I'm just putting marks down, really. And now an even lighter, almost a yellowy green. It actually turns out quite yellow. And I'm putting this over the top of the whole thing, really. Just, again, doing some scribbles. What I like about the Inktense pencils is that they are water soluble, but very intense colors, hence the name, I guess. And so what I'm going to do now is I am going to activate them, but I'm going to be using a mixture of starch adhesive. So I'm using our lace starch, which is a more liquid formulation of our Kansashi starch adhesive. I'm adding a little bit of extra water as well to make it more watery than it was, but still retaining that starch, because what's going to happen is the water and the liquid will activate the Inktense and make those colors spread, but the starch will seal the fabric, so it's really important to have that there. Now, again, you could use a watered down PVA with this, I'm sure, because the principle is the same. You want to seal the fibers so that in the next step we can cut out the leaves. I like the starch because it doesn't take away the original effect of the fabric. So the fabric still looks like fabric as opposed to going shiny as it might with a PVA or a gel medium, and it doesn't go quite so hard. It's like a nice starch shirt. You can get a crisp line in it if you really want to. So I'm just doing all of the leaves, that's spreading that color out. This is all dried. I have heat sealed it. I used my heat gun to just make sure that it was dry with heat to help set those pigments. And then I decided that my log was a little dark. It's not completely dry at the moment, but it's quite dry. And so I've just added a few more, some of the Inktense pencils to just bring up lighter colors to bring up that texture. And there's the back. You can see that I haven't really bothered. The next thing to do is to cut out the leaf shapes. So what I'm going to do, starting out a little bit off camera, is cut out a sort of heart shape. You can do a triangle shape if that's easier for you because it's so small, but just a little slight heart shape. And I'm going to go ahead and cut out all of those leaves. And because of the starch, obviously the fabric isn't fraying. And before I add my leaves, I need to add a vine and I need to make some tendrils. The vine is going to be added in the first instance using a piece of green perlé cotton, which I have threaded onto a needle. As I said before, the log is not fully dry. Now this is on purpose because I want to draw the needle through at the edges or underside just to hold this vine in place. And I thought that perhaps it wouldn't work if it was fully solid 24-hour dry. However, some of it was wetter than I thought, and you do have to be really careful that that tissue paper does not rip. So, take your time. I'm using a very thin, long needle and just trying to take my time through it. I do rip a little section as I'm working, but thankfully it was at the back and it wasn't anything that was going to cause any issues. And so I'm twisting around and I'm playing around trying to decide on the placement. And I also sort of go back over to make the vine a little bit thicker in an area. So I've got some. Now I'm using a fine floss silk. This is a weaving silk that I dyed a long time ago, but it's like an Ovale silk. I've just put some of the starch onto my fingers and run it along the thread. And now I'm going to wind that around a pin. And this is to make the tendrils. And I'm going to make 2 of these. And I'm going to leave it on the pin, not until it's entirely dry, but until it's fairly dry. In the end, I'll only use one of them, but it always helps to make more than you need instead of having to go back. Now I'm taking some more of that silk floss and I'm going to wrap it around the vine, the cotton vine that I wrapped around before. So I'm not trying to cover it completely so that it's like a gimp, otherwise I would have just used a gimp thread. Instead I wanted something that sort of varied in size and texture. So I'm just wrapping it around certain areas. Floss silk snags on everything. So if you're going to do the same thing, take your time. It continually, I've built up so much texture on that log that the silk just did not want to behave. I talked it into behaving eventually, but it wasn't a pretty sight in some cases. Some of the knots were not very nice. So there's my vine wrapped, and you can see because the colors contrast, that looks quite nice. You don't actually see a lot of this in the end. I'm just taking those about halfway dry tendrils, sliding them off of the pins now, so that they can dry completely and not be stuck to the pin. And that is a technique that you can also use with PVA as well. You don't have to use the starch. And now I can start adding the leaves. Leaves can be stitched on from the top down, from the bottom up, however you want. I'm also shaping some of them a little bit by folding in half for this one, and the next leaf I sort of roll around the needle, and because they've been starched, it does hold. It holds that shape quite nicely, but this point is just a case of, you know, just one little stitch, stitching each of the leaves to the vine. So here's where I'm rolling on the needle, just to give a little bit more body. I then decide I'm just going to stitch them on, and I'll worry about adding a little bit more body afterwards, because it was a little bit awkward holding on to such tiny little leaves. And of course, once the silk's got a snag in it, it keeps snagging. But just be patient with it and it'll be all right. If you know, that's daunting, just use embroidery thread, whatever you've got. So there is my little log covered in ivy leaves. And as I say, they look a little flat, but before we do that, I'm going to add one of those tendrils. So I've taken one of them and just snip the end of the thread so that I can thread the needle so that they're an even length. And all I'm going to do is stitch this into the vine that we placed underneath the leaves. So you can put as many as you like. As I said, in the end, I only use one of the two that I made. And it is a little detail. I mean, you have to look closely at the button to be able to see it. When you're stitching underneath and through the vine, you can feel that you've got the vine. You don't need to attempt to go through the tissue paper. And then I'm just trimming down because I don't want it quite so long. Now I'm going to use tweezers and just curl and bend and just add a little bit more life to those ivy leaves. And again, because they've been starched, once I sort of press them into place, they do hold, which is a really nice thing about the starch. Then I decide it's still a little too dark, so I'm just adding some lighter mica powders, just to highlight some of the texture of the log. You obviously don't have to do this. Working with browns, you could probably even put a little bit of face powder on it, because, you know, just to highlight the upper part of it, or you could dry brush with paint. And then I'm putting a little bit of green in as well, I felt that it was all just a little bit too flat. And I keep faffing. I did keep tweaking this button quite a lot. Now I'm going to make the back. The first thing I'm going to do is just draw around the shape of the button. This has to be done, of course, after you've done the front to make sure that it fits. I'm going to cut out this shape. It's not exact, it's a sort of shape around it. I'm going to cut this out from card. You could use a heavy pelmet interfacing, or even a bit of plastic packaging, whatever is to hand. This just adds the strength to the back. I'm also going to cut out the same shape from a piece of felt, and then a slightly bigger shape from the same fabric that I was using for the leaves. I'm going to put them all together, so fabric, felt, then card, and gather up that fabric and make like a little covered button. So the back, the working side, the gathered thread, is going to be against the back of the front of the button. So as you can see, makes a nice smooth finish. I do decide that that's far too pale for the log, and I go ahead and color that with some more of the wood crystals to get a nice dark color. But I ended up not showing it fully with the video. What I'm doing now is I'm poking 2 holes with an awl quite close together so that I can add the shank. I've made the shank out of a little piece of jewelry wire, put it into a horseshoe shape. I'm poking from the good side down to the bad side, just in case the cardboard sort of leaves a rough mark, a rough bit. It's going to be on the inside of the button, as it were. Now I'm putting that horseshoe of wire through those 2 holes. And then when I decide on the sort of depth that I want the shank to be, which you can just see when I bring the sponge in, you see. And I can sort of adjust and decide how deep I want that shank to be. And then I will fold the wire out like a staple so that it's either side. Now I'm going to glue this back. I'm actually using some more of the gel medium, and I'm going to glue the back to the front. I'm trying not to have too much. It looks like there's a fair bit of medium there, but actually at the edges there's a small amount, which is why I'm going on with the brush, so that hopefully it doesn't seep out when I push it together. Now, of course, that needs to be held tight. And I could use little clips, but I thought if I do that, I run the risk of the paper mache changing. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to bind it with some of the cotton thread. And literally that is it. I'm just wrapping the cotton thread around and around to hold the top and the bottom together while the glue dries. And I'm wrapping it quite tightly. But my thinking was that even if this leaves a mark, it's not going to be a very noticeable mark. In the end, it didn't leave any marks at all, so I was very happy that I went this route as opposed to a clip pressing the whole thing in. And there it is, all glued on. I did seal the back as well with starch again after I coloured it, which of course means it's nice and stiff, so I can also sign the back of the button. Thanks ever so much for watching. I hope you found that helpful and not too confusing. And it's probably the last time I do a video like this. It was hard to edit. Do please hit like, click subscribe, and take care of yourselves. I'll see you in the next video. Bye-bye.